이제 두고 쇼라라라 메메다미야 지원보다 제전에서 제제라 저와 산제 숨바라도 신대외 주로 주바제다 제제된 배천에 디레시에 대외제 대레제 세베지 tenje chabata susada ndela banya jasan sunsa ye be ambetana le batala tu besunya je na mola ya katala tubunda da mi kana ro ku je dano chisa bondo tamje ka do da ke che den do sa o ya da jini ani 시작 가서 동안 자서 내려 타 남바꾼도 예매돼 지지친이 지원하라 지바치다를 잼메뉴 세가다 소하나 신체 다지 등그 가서 아니 코와다다 동아지 라신도 통네 테라 메데빙에 주적거와 예상 동안 자서 될라다 세가라 동아세테 안에 사전 예len지 풍부 코와 가상 시원나 신체 량여주 샤원도 주 풍부되라 아니 타요와 말이 풍부디 진대에 배 통만 매반에 진에 지대 주대 량여주 왕그 풍부디 진에 지대 주대 통만 타 요와 말이스 동아자서 탐이 타양 아니 랑기 녀보 동아지 풍부되기 량여주 왕그 주 풍부디 귤안 내봐 아니 내제 녀보 맞게 봐도 아니 가서를 탐해봐 녀보 덤된게나 아니 교 량년 가발라 때네 아니 풍부되 가고 와 인자 이다 동안자서 딜라타 나바꾼도 예매대 지지친이 증원에 자소 시원에 탐해봐다 자소라 뜬다 탐면 거만해서 코위 깨와라야 통만 탐에 탐해봐 탐에 타양 녀보 덤된지 맞아 봐봐 둘에 녀보 덤된지 맞아 봐도 탐에 탐해봐 인자 단 풍부되 련 친제라 아니 동아지라 신뢰 맞아봐요 인자 동아자서 딜라네 남바꾼도 다 지지친이 증원에 세달량이지 왕게 코리지 지바치를 잼미주로서 지바 잼미지지 지바적으로 세 동아 믿어봐다 더더봐 하셔 줘야 봐 인자 아니 다 지바적으로 다 동아 믿어봐야나 아니 등에나 동아기 예매 삼고 봐야자 아니 지고 등에 가서 아니 동아지 예매서 땅 마마 이 동아지 예매 삼에 아니 동아지 예매 동아 믿어봐야자 아니 동아라 탄되지 동아라 탄되지 이거나 아니 동아 레부 동아 도바 제발라 아니 줄량이 도거와 대라야 아니 자와 단진 가서래 거기 자와지 말이 봐 도거에 다 도서만 방치한 거야 말이야.
No. So, as it says in the 400 verses by Arya Deva, this ocean of suffering that we are in, it's beginningless. There's no sort of beginning point for this ocean of suffering. And so long as we don't rely on the proper antidotes to turn away the causes of our suffering, there will be no sort of end point to this ocean of cycling in samsara. And so, why is it that beings don't give rise to fear, seeing that they're bound in this situation? So this ocean of suffering that we are in, this ocean of samsara, has no beginning to it. We can't trace back and find the beginning to this cycle of samsara. And as I said earlier, samsara is identified as taking up these appropriated aggregates, these contaminated aggregates, due to the force of karma and the afflictions. And so as long as we take up these aggregates due to that power of karma and afflictions, we won't pass beyond this nature of suffering. Everything that we experience after will be in the nature of suffering. So as long as you're taking up these contaminated aggregates, you will continue to experience this kind of suffering. And so we all naturally want to be free from suffering, and we all naturally want to have happiness, but unless you actually work at the causes of that, or in this case, apply the proper antidote to the root of samsara, there's no way we can get out of this situation. And so first we have to recognize this kind of situation of suffering that we are in, and then make an effort to turn away from the causes or apply the proper antidote. If we don't want this result of suffering, we have to try to remove the causes. So it's because we don't recognize the situation that we're in that we don't give rise to a kind of fear at this. Now, this here is what one contemplates as a being of the middling scope. So looking at the defect of the sufferings of samsara and recognizing the situation that we are in, one then generates this wish to be freed from that suffering. Once you have recognized the kind of situation you're in, you have a mind wanting to get out of that. And in order to get out of that, you see that it's this ignorance, this grasping at a self that is the most fundamental root cause of cycling in samsara. And so in order to get out, one has to apply the proper antidote. But until one recognizes this situation of suffering and has some kind of fear at it, some kind of desire to get freed from it, then one won't make the effort to reverse those causes.
Oh yeah, that day is Thomas Casore. You watch you all that Dunga Yemi Sako Waiza, Tana Dunga Same, Casa Dunga, any Kochi Dunga Sava, Casetam, Sosi Dunga, me Dunga Sabara, Jawaki, and it to me, Dunga get it Chinsani. That he, Jela, Kochi Dunga Sabaki, and yet I Casore. Take something my body. Tena. Dunga tru sambalani, dunga truni, never meba, say, Daniel never meba. Or Daniel to Juba, the young ever, Pani Puni, Mani Chumani, Papurtua, Mani, and Pani to Juba, Dradu Juba, Pani Puni, Mani Chumani, Jibu Dradu, the Juba, the Senido, Toba, Toatan and watch, Gambeji, and so on, I see Daniel and Watanimaba. Reciting and trying Zawojo. Zawotini, and young Castle Tajua, what in the Juliet, Daniel and your meba, said, only or maybe never chick. Dinity Gala, Koyu Pinzola, Chisam Jajang, Wamba maybe Yawa. Really just la lava, you, Oma to the tattoo so, give you just to draw a tell Chamani to Dunsalo, say, Koyu Pinzola, Chitam Lejang, I know about Zanimaba. Oh, I know what maybe Yawa said him. He jela, and let Redani Ripumbo, Himbonyabani, their jurisdiction, and sending so on as it and Lu Yanda Yando Doi, Yawa. Yeah,
So first, in order to generate a mind of renunciation, one has to contemplate the defects of samsara and recognize its suffering nature. And so it's based upon this recognition of the faults of samsara that one can give rise to renunciation. So we had gone through the sort of individual sufferings of samsara, in particular looking at those that apply to humans, in particular these 8 types of suffering. And now we turn to the 6 types of suffering. The first of these, and these are general sufferings of samsara, the first is that the problem that life has no certainty. There's no, we don't experience any sort of definite certainty within samsara, and we need to come to a recognition of this. So there are verses like from Nagarjuna that say, men who fathered sons in turn are sons, and mothers likewise daughters. Bitter foes turn into friends, and the converse is true. Because of this, samsara is never sure. So we can never be certain about the kind of relationships that we have with people. Some become friends, some become enemies. There's no sort of stability or certainty. And then the second type of suffering is the problem that we always have more, or we always want more than we have. So there's no sort of satisfaction or satiation within samsara. We keep indulging in the pleasures of samsara, but there's no sort of satisfaction or satiation that comes from this. And again, Nagarjuna has a verse which says that, know that every being has drunk more milk than all the 4 great oceans could contain, and still, by emulating common folk, they'll circle, drinking ever more and more. So you can continue to indulge in these pleasures of samsara, but you'll never reach a point of satisfaction. You just continue to cycle, wanting more and more.
Oh yeah, that is my you yanda to do in what 다 양양 인삼 조빈 니와 세가네 양다 양도 냐와이 상신난도 강도와 제주난그 출라양 안에 태산매봐 편진最近的话有国家话看一把产品这点来讲托起咱产品的时候干了年外阳单的年外年咱们家话给人家的看说的阳单年外年咱家话也就那年咱们家话的他忙不有吧他彻底说那些钱呢咱们这就没这样团面都就年话噻的家近几天去就呢你来就往个抢设定中噻你打看说这样不家近都叫完了呢呀天天马桶的你要马桶哎我呢看说的처음에 배냐와 깨나야 단이 치지지 친나야 단이 치지지 동화 가시야 메잖아 그게 자가 지시차 소하나시 처음에 배 동화 다 준줄라를送把 텐데 다 조어들을 送把 나시 전에 다 생각해
So then there is the problem that we have to keep shucking off bodies over and over again. So we have to keep discarding our bodies and take up more bodies and then keep going through that again and again. And then there is the problem that we have to keep going into a new life over and over again. So we have to keep taking up rebirth again and again. And then there is the problem that we go up and down in our fortunes in life over and over. So we've each been born as like Indra, and then through the force of samsara, we end up having to go back into the hell realms. So it's you may have experienced the birth of being Indra, universally revered, and will fall again to earth through action's force. And he who ruled the universe as king will be a slave within samsara's wheel. So we have to keep going up and down again. We have no way to predict where we will take rebirth, and we move through the highest realms to the lowest. And then there's the problem that no one can come along with us. Ultimately, we are alone. When we move between lives, then we end up having to be completely alone. We don't have any sort of friends or companions as we go. We can't take anything with us. So there is then the sixth type, that we are ultimately alone. We have to go alone through samsara.
Oh yeah. 지단되나 대배다 강도 여게 엄마매 비냐와디 엄마매 비냐와디 지단되는 대배 명어 딜레卷쳐와 민두제 자원 알라 뉘장 샤심스 자원 알라 뉘게 아니 자원 사이 대바 강인바 대신 매이 대바 강심 강인바 대다 탐제 미지 뒤토장 대장 마서 대장 양초로 세간 수완 나시 전에 사이 대바다 미 대바 첨나양 안에 다 자원 알라 뉘자 디아친 순주 자숨라지 자숨라잖아요 안에 자신 그때 칠러 왕와 중 자신 그때 칠러 왕와 중에 대장 모임 바 대용조라 왕와 되네 안에 되는 말 소리와 어 가서래 송하게 네대 텐디가 되니다 엄마매 바게라 예와이 자존심 잡아 인상 어디 송고 봐 지단되는 대배명은 받으라卷쳐봐 미도 봐 자원 알라 뉘장 자존심
So these problems or defects of samsara are described at length in the standard works on the steps to Buddhahood, and these we should recall these types of sufferings, in that we go from having indulged in the highest sort of pleasures, being born, for example, as a deity in the heaven of 33, and then through the force of our actions, we're going to have to fall again into samsara, and we're never sort of satiated. Whatever high position we may go into and whatever we may get to enjoy, we're never fully satisfied with that, and we have to move on and end up experiencing suffering. So we should remember the King Method, whose last words were, "There is no greater evil in the world than the fact that we always want more than we have." And so no matter how many sort of pleasures we have indulged in, we always want more. We're never satisfied with what we have. There's no satiation within samsara.
Oh yeah. 다들 막 제가 해서 라르라 준말라 로바 퇴산다 봉화 3대 차와 디엘이메 봉화 시와 추중송을 치 디니를 민다와 진의 케어다 다 봉화다 로바 퇴산다 봉화 3년 일에 미다와 주나 켜와다 주도 이가 좀 봐시 오면 되니 매나 대마와 차마와 손에 쳐가야 무정어지 대야 대신 조심 마대 대마와 차와 마종하대 다 대지 조심 마련 마대 betjere 손데 다 되네 들이 동아 숨숨 배서 다 동아 계산받아 아니 족산받아 아니 저어디 아니 동아 숨시 요 두송고 아래다 가서래 엄마 주비 동아 라브리체 말았잖아 엄마 주비 동아 엄마 주비 동아 엄마 주비 동아 아니 동아지 동아 규 동아 차와도지 그 동아 제가 동아라 아수샤야 와 아니 다 동아지 엄마 주비 동아 세대 간지질라서 그래 sana 아니 사자지 내려지 풍봉 아마라 때네 량이지 왕거 추we 풍봉 아마 때라 때네 아니 사자지 내려지 풍보 치마도 량이지 왕거 추we 아니 풍보 치마된 주바 인상 엄마 주비 동아스 엄마 주비 동아스 엄마 주비 동아스나 간지질서 그래 sana 풍보 딜렘발라 때네 아니 가와다 나와다 치와라 소위 동아 탐제 아니 부동아 탐제 풍부 딜렘발라 때나 중화 인상 아니 엄마 주비 동아스 엄마 주비 동아스 디네 대제라 동아지 동아스 아니 다 와라 탐발라 동아지 동아당 아니 규위 동아당 어tada 오라마 통그리 규위 동아당 아니 동아지 동아당 아니 차와 되지 그 동아랑 그 오세르가나 오 동아 가수스 마송 거래
당분이디 양계 동양 당분이디 양계
엄마 주비 동아스 엄마 주바사 사전 예례지 풍봉 아마라 때네 심하디 주버 쳐봐 인상 엄마 주비 동아스 와 엄마 주비 동아스나 사전 예례지 풍보대 주발라 때네 아니 가와다 나와다 치와라 소베 동아 탐자 풍보대 주발라 때네 중화 인상 엄마 주비 동아
니바디
대니와치 대니 유동아 유동아다 원아마 통도와 아니 유동아다 아니 동아지 동아 아니 차와도저 그 동아랑 그 오서 동아 가서 시작거래 그러나
So then here it continues saying that there are only two things we should be doing here: read the holy books, get teaching on them, contemplate their meaning, live a life of rejection, and stay in meditation. So here, if we can engage in these activities, studying and living a life of renunciation, if we can keep from going beyond these two activities, one day we can become both wise and realized. But if we neglect those and we lose ourselves in something they call lots of things to think about and lots of things to do, but not doing any spiritual practice whatsoever. So one should not get lost in the sort of worldly activities, but rather keep to these kinds of goals that one is striving after. So then we turn to, now we've gone through the 8 types of suffering, the 6 types of suffering, and then it'll turn to the 3 types of suffering. But there are actually sort of 5 types of suffering. Jampa, do you know what you call those? Yeah. Okay, so what? Yeah. So this, having taken up these contaminated aggregates, the fact that we have taken up these contaminated aggregates means that we have this basis, which is the basis on which we accomplish our sort of future suffering. So it's on the basis of having previously accumulated certain deeds and so forth that we then have these aggregates that we have taken up and appropriated, and it's on the basis of these aggregates that we then experience all of the various types of suffering and actually accumulate those actions that lead to the future suffering. So as we've already accomplished or established these aggregates that we have now, these are the basis for then experiencing all of the suffering of this life, as well as for accomplishing the kind of causes that lead to our future suffering. So these types of suffering are explained again within the Lam Rim here as a group of like 5 types of suffering that these aggregates that we have are established from the previous sort of karma that we have accumulated and are then the basis or the cause for all of the suffering that we experience. And then the next 3 types are this traditional sort of list of 3, the suffering of change, and the suffering of pervasive suffering of conditioned existence.
오야 된다와 인자 된다디 사전 예len지 풍보디 아니 동아지 동아다 주의 동아기 와야 그시 시 풍보될래 발라 때네 아니 동아지 동아다 주의 용아 용거한테 풍보될 때는 중앙 인자 동아지 시체니 늘이 동아 숨송배스 사제지 소와 동아 탐제 동아지 동아인 사제지 소와 탐 소와 동아 탐제 아니 어다 감미 숙세라 소와 사제그 안에 소와 동아 탐제 아니 동아 영화 그와 어때 소와 동아다 감미 숙세라 소와기 아니 다음 천시로 되나 사제지 소와 탐 동아 탐제 동아지 동아체 그와 다른 아랑조라 된다 대화랑만 봐 사제지 소와 대화 탐제해서 대화 동아 치쳐 봐라 가사시와 나신 대화랑만 봐대 대화랑만 봐대 주의 동아스 그 지점 때나 안에 동아지 라신도 주와 인자 나를 토마 안에 가려서 동아 치쳐 봐대 동아지 충도 침받잖아 아니 대화랑만 봐 인자 아니 콜라 주의 동아스 가로 그 아니 대화랑만 봐대 안에 되네 이네시 가서를 동아 치루 동아 치루 줘야 인자 타 동아지 라신은 맞아 봐 인자 사제지 태워 소환 대화 탐제자 뇌 동아 인스 배나 내때 배나 차외 동 시와탕 장위 동제 좋았던 그 차외제 동위체라 안에 시와된데 가나 절에 장원라 때나 아니 참여를 제라 때나 타를 차위 동아지 총도 가서 총도 침발라 아니 대화랑만 봐도 마도 시위 대화 때 대한 사전나 양차위 동아야结果래 로인자 배나 차외 동세 시와장 장위 동에서 절대 봐 대세나야 장위 동아제 치치쳐 봤담라 아니 대화랑만 봐 마도 대절대 봐달라 동아랑신 대화랑신 봐지나 최대 치점 된장 아니 대위랑신 요거와라 대매봐 인상 아니 어디 동아 대신도 좋아다 되바다 살라 롱제발라서 왔다 탐제 토마 아니 과서에 동아디 칠제발라 대화랑만 봐자 마도 라신지 대화지에나 텐라와데 치점 된장 대위 오르 요거와라 대매봐 인상 대대화랑자 봐데 오니지 대화 마인데 세와 오 텐라와데 대화랑자 봐야 오지 마인데 대이나 타동 치점 때나 대화 치료 주고 와래 대 미줘봐 라텔에 동아 중아데 대화랑자 봐면 배다래 야
So here, the fact that we have taken up these contaminated aggregates, it is on the basis of having these aggregates that we then experience all of the various sufferings. So these appropriated aggregates are like the foundation, the basis for experiencing the various types of suffering. So here, this refers to the 3 types of suffering, and so they'll give a brief description here. All impure feelings of pain constitute the first type of suffering, the suffering of suffering. So those impure feelings of pain or suffering that we experience, these constitute the kind of suffering of suffering. These are painful or suffering feelings that beings identify as being painful or suffering. That constitutes this first type of the suffering of suffering, it's often translated. And then all impure feelings of pleasure constitute the second type of suffering, called the suffering of change or suffering of transformation. So here, this is referring to the fact that beings grasp at certain feelings as being pleasant or as being happiness, but in reality, those are still in the nature of suffering. And it isn't the case that whenever you rely upon something that we see as being the cause of happiness, that it will bring about happiness. So, for example, it gives an example here of when you're in a place that's very hot, and then then in that condition, something cool seems like pleasure. So, but if you were to continue to get cooler and cooler and cooler, that wouldn't be pleasurable anymore. It would turn into suffering because it's in the nature of suffering. And when you're in a place that's very cold, then something warm seems like pleasure. So, warmth seems like it's something that is inherently or intrinsically pleasurable. But when you indulge in it more and more, it's not really in the nature of something pleasurable. So these are impure feelings of pleasure or happiness that are really in the nature of suffering. So the same is true when you've had to walk a long way and sitting seems pleasurable, or had to sit for a long time and walking seems pleasurable. None of these things is such that however much you rely on it, you'll become more and more happy. That's not their nature. So none of these things that seem to be pleasure, though, is pleasure by nature, or pleasure in its very essence. If it were, then you would feel more pleasant the more and more you had of them. But this is not the case. We see that everything within samsara is in the nature of suffering, such that no matter when you rely on it more and more, it doesn't actually bring more pleasure. But these things are in the nature of suffering, and so these impure, pleasant feelings are what we call the suffering of change.
오야 대체 다레스 유 동아야 탈라세체 대단다 체체 다 태원 되제 그 동아 가르를 리주 강도 제장 다 렌이지 왕고치 풍보더라 소수 니렌지 리 춤내세 레당 녀몽고 왕게 아니 리디 춤내 대단티 동아 랑제서 여바니 다 예렌지 풍보데 레 친제라 아니 동아지 랑제서 여바데 차와 되제스 차와 세가나 레니지 땡체바가 차완 두치 에세 차와와당 레니지 두체바 와 어디 차완 두치 그 동아세 대송아래 레니지 왕거치 풍보되라 어디 예레지 풍보되 날 줍치제라 아니 다 얘가 다진 주와 나세진의 세디 깨가 나질라 소외 동아 참아 용사데 아니 풍보들레 발레데나 총아레스 와 니리지 풍보디 줍 친자 세디 깨가 나지상 아니 야게 내가 매발라 소바 그 코와치 동아당 아니 야게 미 동아 깨라 소바 다 동아 탐제 용사데 풍보들레데나 용고와 인상 니리지 풍보디 줍 친자라 세디 깨가 나슬라 소외 동아 참아 용사게 땡쳐버레스
So that type of suffering is then the suffering of change. That's what we call that. And the third type of suffering is known as the pervasive suffering, which brings in more, or the pervasive suffering of conditioned existence. And so here, when we take up the appropriated aggregates due to the force of karma and the afflictions, then it is in the nature of suffering. It becomes the support or the basis for then experiencing all of the various types of suffering. So the point here is that regardless of which one of the 6 types of birth we take on a body which, by its very existence, comes complete with its own particular sufferings built in. So from the first moment we take the various impure parts of our being on, from the first moment of their existence, they provide a basis for all sufferings. So these aggregates are the basis, the foundation upon which we are experience all of these various sufferings. So in that way, they are a cause of our being in this suffering situation. So as long as we continue to take rebirth due to the power of our karma and afflictions, we then are going to experience suffering. So this is the basis, again, for all the sufferings we look forward to in life: birth, aging, sickness, and death, the 8 types of suffering that were listed before, the 6 types including uncertainty and the lack of satiation or satisfaction within samsara. All of this comes on the basis of having taken up these various aggregates. So this kind of suffering, pervasive means that when one has taken up the aggregates due to those causes, one will necessarily experience suffering, or everything that comes after it will be in the nature of suffering. So these aggregates are the impure parts of ourself are like a big pot, sucking in the suffering of suffering, the suffering of change in both this and our future lives.
오야 아니 다 가르쳐 그래잖아 대체스 아니 나를 치면 나를 소환 아시지 쿠르 치담 쿠와 대신도 동아지랑신이라 맞아왔어 라 맞아와 대신도 대배라 그네 아니 또 쿠르스랑 도 아니 도체 첨보지 랑그 리딩도 쿠고 주나 아니 쿠르 치담 쿠와 대신도 동아지랑신래 아니 쿠르테다 맞아봐도 대유코가 아니 거기까지 좀 해봐 대배라고 자니 사제니레기 풍비 쿠르 치담 쿠르와 쿠르가와 대신도 아니 동아지랑신래 대유코가 까지 좀 해봐 말이 스마르와 사제니레기 불침 쿠르 치담 쿠와 대신도 동아지랑신래 대유코가 까지 좀 해봐 그래서 다 대들려서 하나세 세대지 니가 동아지 동아당 유유동안이 니 전제지 내다고 쳐봐네. 오사제 니는지 풍부되게 안에 채되지 니가 그 동아지 동아다 유유동안이 전제지 내다고 쳐봐나 사제 니는지 풍부 쪄와지 레미겨와시 마주나. 그와 안에 대 체마여서 그와 마도 냐와 따라서 야나 다주 쿠르데 체막이 아니 체막이 또뭐 쿠르쿠알라잖아 지거래 간제 체명아도 마도 냐왔다 동아宽나라 마데스다 간제 사제니리 풍보되다 마자버랑 정들라 아니 동아제라실에 대외 고가까지다 매바디 순고하려 쿠치성 쿠와 나신 동아제라실에 대외 고가까지다 매바 대신도 사제니리 풍보 쿠르치sam과도 마도 동아제라실에 대외 고가까지다 매바
So here, this suffering, or pervasive suffering of conditioned existence, this is explained in the Great Stages of the Path by Je Lama Tsongkhapa as being like a burden that one carries. So as long as one takes up this burden of the appropriated aggregates, of these impure aggregates taken up due to the force of karma and afflictions, then there isn't even a moment that isn't in the nature of suffering. One doesn't have even just a moment of actual happiness so long as one has taken on this burden, as long as one has taken up these impure aggregates due to the force of karma and afflictions, then one is not beyond this nature of suffering. And so there isn't even one moment that one is experiencing pure happiness, pure good happiness. So from the time that we have taken up these appropriated aggregates, from when we take on this burden, as it says, then we don't experience any sort of real happiness. It's only in the nature of suffering. There's not even a moment of actual happiness. So here again, it says these impure parts of ourself are like a big pot which sucks in the suffering of suffering, the suffering of change, and both this and our future lives. So we must find a way to stop taking births, to stop taking on all the impure parts we're made of, these impure aggregates. Until we do so, our existence will be like lying on a bed of upright needles, never a thing but pain. So here, the solution to this is we have to find a way to stop taking up these impure aggregates. That's the only way to cease this suffering that we experience.
Oh yeah. Anita dungale meshe. Koala tar shewa yang lumba jine shendu tawa tabo mayimba. Ra. Oh da kandere yesara kowa se kasan shuwa nashi chene. Kowa ni sache nile yu pumbi yunam chala shese. Sache nile pumbo ane pumbi yun ane yang si chima lenyi yu wanga yinzam jobi chala. Da kari shanda digore. 와 고아가 저기 완전하잖아. 고아 생각 사전 일이 풍부하셔야. 풍부기 귀라제. 아니 양시 천만 인삼 조비 차라자야. 가르잖아 저거 그래. 와 오차라 전에 오 된다비 차라 전에 대담에 또 비셔러지 자원에 귀차가지고 그래. 사전 일이 풍부디 자원에 귀차가. 사전 일이 풍부 자원에 귀차가 제발라. 아니다 내가 니근테 자와니 태양 지도 달래 중 대마리 때 테라 세단 나서 중 전에 남들 가서 저거나 거기 동안 탐제지 자와데 다 단지 말이 봐인 바래 그러와 단지 말이 봐 단지 말이 봐이다 단지 말이 봐기 아니 세임에 봐 다음에 봐도 비셔라도 고와요 아래 시럽이 나태 담에도 비 시럽지 자원의 귀체바나 아니 코알라 타발라 타바실 세세와 인 시가라 인자 담에 때라 바니 시비사변 남시티 유남태 시유로 유라담에 토나니 시비사변 가바 주르산에 시제가 가서 써봤으니 시비사변 남시티 유남 대의 제유로 세가나 시비 사변데 교 조어데 규자와데 가와를 도서나 코와데 내니 유왕의 중요 코와 풍부데 제제데 레그 자와 마리바 마리바 때레를 마리바라 투바에서 시비 사변 남시데 유남 대의 제유로 단지 말해봐지 유남 대의 제일로 세가나 단지 말해봐지 아니 나도 좋았지 봐 나도 좋았지 봐기 진주달에 다음에 봐 토나 아니 된다왜 다음에 봐 토면 로데 콘배 아니 단 거기 자와 12세배 단지 말해봐지 아닌가 나제 말이 바가베 아니 티왕게 레사바데가 대가베 아니 코와 랭이지 왕게 품비지데 가고와 이상 대도 수어도와 코와네 사전 예len지 품비지남 차텔라 차베 대다음에 또 비제럽지 자와네 귀제바나 아니 코와라 타바 사전 예len지 품보텔라 대담 빵바 인자라 코와라 타바 세와 인
So when we talk about escaping samsara, it's not like running away from one country and managing to reach another. This isn't how we should think about getting out of samsara. As I've explained, the aggregates, these appropriated aggregates, contaminated aggregates that are taken up due to the force of karma and afflictions are what we should understand as being samsara. And so we need to understand how it is that the root of samsara is our grasping, our misapprehension and ignorance, which is grasping at a self. And so by realizing, by cultivating the wisdom that realizes selflessness, one is able to remove that root, that fundamental cause, which makes us cycle in samsara. So there is a verse from Aryadeva's 400 verses, where he talks about this process by which one has to remove the sort of root, the ignorance grasping at a self, in order to then turn away or reverse karma, which then is able to reverse samsara, which is this very taking up of the appropriated aggregates due to the force of those afflictions and karma. So if one wants to stop this process of cycling through samsara, one has to first begin by determining, resolving the meaning of emptiness based upon thinking about it and contemplating it. And then when one cultivates this wisdom that recognizes that a self doesn't exist in the way that we apprehend it to, in the way that we grasp at it as existing, then we are able to remove the sort of root of samsara. This grasping at a self can be counteracted by the wisdom realizing that that type of self does not exist. So if we are able to cultivate this wisdom, cultivate the antidote to that grasping at an inherently existent self that's somehow set up from its own side, if we can cultivate that, we then remove that ignorance, which then causes us not to create karma, and therefore not to take up these appropriated aggregates, which are samsara itself. So it is by this process of then cultivating the antidote to the root of samsara that we're able to reverse it. So here it says, cyclic existence, or samsara, is precisely the continued existence, the very fact of the impure parts that make up the impure parts of our being that we've taken on. And when the continued existence of these parts or these aggregates is stopped at its root by the wisdom that realizes that nothing has a self-nature, then this is our escape from samsara. So it is, we have to understand the process by which this happens, as well as what samsara really is in being these appropriated, contaminated aggregates.
Oh yeah, 세바 인생. 단다 되나 가서를 권세바 나신 세인신. 아니 두대 그 예매상. 두대 코야 예매상 받아 군중 코비 주를 삼바. 아니 다 된데 연락 중이도 좀 아삼네. 다 가제 가서 코비 예매 삼니까네. 아니 코알에 와 좀 와게 내중 타발 내중 코비 동안에 와시에 타발라 전에 그 로제 제도 담아 안에 뒤 치면 나셔 도수의 대인 말이. 그러나 치면 한자 도수시 치면 한자 도수 인자 치면 한자 도수 간에 내중 제와 두den게 님이 300관에 코타다랑 와 지금 해주제 요즘 주베다 코타당 랑와 지금 요즘 제대 교주 가수现在当我那个루비 추디 세잖아요. 당 요즘 게왜 착하되지래. 세더라. 아니 다 잡자 숨바더라. 숨방 요즘 게왜 차니 대다 코야 핀조라. 유명까지 있다냐 미제신 인생군도 타바 되니로 주나 대전 요즘 게와라. 어때 다 대다 권배 아니 두된 님이 삼네. 가서 권도 쳐봐서 두된 게 님이 삼네. 아니 두된 게 님이 삼네. 아니 코와 타다 동아제라시 코와라 샤바 샤로 주내전지 세통와 나신기 코와 타다 동아제라신도 통나하러 대다 코에 핀조라 아니 배 유명까지 다 맞아봐. 코와 타다 동아제라신 주내전지 세통와 나신기 아니 유명까지 다야 미제신 아니 인생군도 타바트니에서 가나 아니 코이 동안에 와라 시바기 아니 타바트니 로데 아니 왕암 쇼쇼지 제와지 추나 아니 의중을 삼바제마 많이 받제와 임바래 또 왕암 쇼쇼가 맞잖아야 코이 예미 300관에 아니 의중을 삼바제마 제투게나 제게나 당 가서 지문이 영화 많이 봐라. 지마 잠지가 의중 영화 제출고 임바리. 이상 대다 코에 핀조라 유명까지 있잖아. 미시진 인연군도 타바텐전에 주나 대전 의중 제발라. 다 직코랑 된다 된대 이제 다들 된다 오늘 연구로 와야.
So here, then, this completes the explanation of how to stop desire for future lives. So here, thinking about the defects of samsara, recognizing the sort of truth of suffering, and understanding the suffering situation we're in, as well as recognizing the kind of causes that lead to that suffering, then one gives rise to this mind seeking to gain freedom from that and turning away from both future lives and life within samsara. And so the third section, the next verse, deals with a sort of measure of having developed renunciation. At what point we can say we have developed renunciation. So the verse reads, "When you've meditated thus and feel not even a moment's wish for the good things of samsara, and when you begin to think both day and night of achieving freedom, you've found renunciation." So when we have the wish to get out entirely from this suffering situation and don't even have a moment of wanting the good things of samsara, we're then able to generate a real kind of renunciation from wanting samsara. So this begins by then habituating our minds to thinking about the defects of samsara, reflecting again and again until you generate this kind of disgust where you don't have any sort of desire for cyclic existence, for life in samsara, not even a moment of wishing for those things. And so in order to get this kind of strong sense of renunciation, this isn't something that we can just have sort of an artificial or contrived sense of renunciation, but rather we need to contemplate again and again in order that we give rise to a feeling that is uncontrived, that is not artificial, but that arises day and night, and you don't need to think about it. It's something that is really strong within you. So suppose you've contemplated thus on the points already mentioned, your impermanence, the births of misery, the principles of action and their consequences, and so forth. And because of this, you see for yourself that it's all meaningless, that even if you achieve the kind of happiness pleasure beings enjoy in their paradises, it's really nothing but suffering, that until you can escape forever from samsara, this is the only way it will be. So one needs to come to a determination, resolve that all of life within samsara is in the nature of suffering, and this have a strong wish to be freed from that, to get out of that. That's something that's not artificial or contrived, but something that's uncontrived.
Oh yeah, 대다 미다바다 나송당 나송고 미다바 치와 미다바 삼바 체디 유디 미rum 비치와 미다바 삼바다 치네 아니 매도 매도바 아니 제와 랭고와야 대양 레상한게 왕도치 아니 제수단에 제고와야 나송도 치난 가지 동아 사바다 어 아니 대 년지 동아 삼바다 아니 렌데 가서 렌데 질삼바다 체다 삼바라 소바게 아니 렌데당 아니 대외레지 나서도 마제와 아니 편제계획 날라다나 아니 된지 된산시 토바듯이 이나양 아니 동아지라시나 맞아봐 남 삼배 아니 다 코와디나 타바시 마주 친제라 아니 하이 되지 하이 되지 톱자 동아지 코나래 인보 매바 통화 마세 아니 다시 시원한 상바당 자신의 콜리기위 자유 반조라야 유명까지 자면 미지신 대다다 동아지라신 탈을 안에 동아지라신 대왕을 로진하시 전에 콜리기위 자유 반조라야 유명까지 자면 미지신 인생군도 세와 빼나 샘자 첨부 예비 미대 참모 2년에 세리지 대상랑 참바다를 남삼장 angam shuji taba tenye ke lo jema ma yin ba jewa ni da angam shu nju ji be cai yin ya.
So here you contemplate thus thinking about all of these points that have come before, your own impermanence, births in the lower realms, thinking about the principles of karma and actions and their results, both the sort of general contemplations and for specific actions and so forth. And then you contemplate that the sufferings of the happier births as well, thinking that even if you're not born in the lower realms, none of this within samsara is beyond the nature of suffering. So even those sorts of good rebirths are still in the nature of suffering. You come to see that all of that is, as it says here, meaningless. It's nothing but suffering. And then it comes even stronger in your heart. You feel not even a moment's wish for the fantastic riches of the godlike beings like Indra or being a wheel-turning emperor. Even if you were to gain those sorts of pleasurable existence, one wouldn't be beyond the nature of suffering. So one isn't even attached to the sort of highest births within samsara. One has this feeling that there's no admiration or no desire for the pleasures of samsara because one sees this as being in the nature of suffering. And so you feel no wish for the things like being a really fantastically powerful being like Indra or a very wealthy one like a wheel-turning emperor who rules the world. And then a certain thought comes to your mind both day and night. That is, in every conscious minute, the thought rushes into your mind on its own. The way a man with some great worry on his mind remembers that his problem all in a rush. So here, this gains the kind of strength of realization such that it naturally arises. It comes into our consciousness every moment. It's not something that we have to make an effort to contemplate, but it becomes a kind of uncontrolled feeling that comes to mind both day and night.
Oh yeah, that 남조기 대바도라 안에 주부 춘르게 남데 단조니가 찰라로 봐 이라 공배 체대 나샤도 세데 아니 가송 그 동안에 내와 춘네 체대 나샤도네 온도 삼미터니데 대체 어디에게 주부 춘을 가라 진짜 담보니 오데 아니 가송 그 동안에 내와 춘아 준데 어디 체대 나샤도 주당 아니 대제라 코엔도 동안에 내와 준데 아니 치면 나샤도 주 셔봐 인자 어때니 오데 라브랭기 담보대 주부 춘고다 치만이 오데 주부 증거 전에가네 아니 내중고 콘수도 안에兄弟 체절에 충중게 라남 내중고 콘수도 와데兄弟 체절에 되네다 내중 가상 아마 시원 하시잖아요 내중 아니 아버지 예디 가라 내중 그 삼바제마 많이 바지 예디 가라 아니 대랑 아니 동아지 나서 삼데 아니 동아라 메집에 내중 깨디 잡아 대리바 현라 섬제 현지도도 팬 배워나 아니 이제 깨디 내라고 연구와 일단 대승과래 내중이 이제 집에 교통만 많이 봐 임배 이제도 용와라 오늘 내중 그 삼바 제마 많이 봐시 껴고 그래요 라동아지 나주 삼배 삼배 바부 요구 잠매봐 스타카성 아마 시원하시잖니 동아지 나주 삼바랑 내중 자와매 바부 요구 잠매봐 시라 섬전신 동아지 나와라 미세베 이제 제사 이제 원사요 말에 어디 매봐대다 진주기lum가서 시원하시잖니 섬전디다 남라 어서야라 안에 랑게 된도 내중 자와지고 그래서 랑게 된도 딘디셈 아니 랑동아지 나와라 메서밖에 내주지 고그래 랑게도 진리심 밀람도야 마메나 아니 현 동아지 나와라 메서비 이제 제셔요 제사지와 말에 세가라 현지도 갈라지 예송
So, when you begin to think this way of wishing to have freedom from samsara, when you genuinely want freedom this way, well, then you know you found renunciation. That's the sort of measure of having found renunciation. So, now the standard texts on the stages of the path to Buddhahood have sections ranging from the teaching on the difficulty of finding leisure and fortune up to the instructions on renunciation, all included under the two headings of path for practitioners of lesser scope and paths for practitioners of medium scope. So here, these all sort of come together in the three principal aspects of the path under the headings of turning away from future lives and then turning away from samsara altogether. So here in verse 4, where we read that leisure and fortune are so hard to find and life's not long, think it constantly, stop desire for this life, and then think over and over how deeds and their fruits never fail, and the cycle's suffering, stop desire for the future. That verse then encompasses both the paths for practitioners of lesser scope and those for medium scope. So this all comes under the heading of renunciation. So there's a unique feature. This is a unique feature of this work, and there's a reason for this. Is that one needs to generate renunciation because this is the one special cause that brings you to get what we call great compassion. And so in order to generate compassion, we have to first have a thought of renunciation. Great compassion is this state of mind where you can absolutely no longer bear to see other beings tormented by the suffering of life. But there's no way that you can achieve that as long as your concern about the way life torments you yourself is so feeble that it couldn't blow down a single upright hair. So one needs to have a strong sense of renunciation, an uncontrived, really genuine kind of renunciation in order to be able to generate compassion that is unable to bear the suffering state of other sentient beings. If you haven't contemplated this in relation to yourself, then there's no way that you can have this kind of wish to free others. So as I've quoted before from the Bodhisattva's way of life, even if people like these have never before, even in the dreams they dream, felt such a wish for themselves, how can it come to them for others? So if you haven't had a desire to get out of samsara, if you haven't recognized the suffering situation and given rise to a strong desire to get out, then there's no way that you can give rise to compassion, wishing to be able to free others from that state.
Oh yeah. 태양 란디 누고 마서 란 동아지 나와라 미서봐. 그와 내중체. 현 동아지 나와라 미서봐데 니제테체. 란 동아지 나주삼데 란 동아지도 나와라 미서봐다라 내와 중아. 대섬챈 현지도 버데 현 동아지 나와라 미서봐 니제다 다주 권 신소아. 어 텐자외 내중당 아니 니제 제와라. 아니 다 라브린라바 태삼시고래서 드리제 원래 장고 장하고 집이 리송 레버송 자주 라브렌라 태삼시대에서 다 라브른 체중 간제 있나라 아니 봐 태삼시대 아니 뭐 신도 아니 기부 친구는 막 친구이라 로자니 아니 딩게 나가서 내중 그 삼바 아버지 제대가 아니 이제 제와래라고 연구 와인장 어디 로장고래 라자나 차소님은 제배도 들어왔는데 안에다 기부 친구기 람 잠라야 로마자와 그 껴래 뭐 마장부 껴연배 아니 껴연배 로제단 담반 남지 셔로단 담반 남지 안에 되게 가서래 뭐시당 주주당 내고 제세 와서 아니 변당 무디바다비 아니 차라리 로제라 봐이 랑게 임하죠 봐 로 담바치네 아니 롱데네 숨당 아니 라와숨 트루지 라와 띵어지 라와 셔럽지 라와 숨지 인보 되와데 아니 데네 숨당 라와 숨지 인보 되와데 다 자주 남지를 받들이 자주 라를 된바디 임베 딜라 퇴상 관습사 자고 그래
So here we can look at it like this, that renunciation and compassion are like the same state of mind, just that one is developed by meditating on your own situation and the other by meditating on others' situation. So renunciation is generated when you think about the defects of samsara and the sufferings of samsara and have a strong desire to get out for yourself. But this is the same sort of attitude, but it's being developed in relation to others when we generate compassion, unable to bear seeing others in that situation. So in order to develop this kind of compassion, we need to undertake the study and contemplation of the steps or the stages of the path to Buddhahood. This is the great teaching of the protector Tsongkhapa, and thus gradually train our minds. So this is something that we need to hear and think about again and again, whatever sort of length of Lamrim text we go through. We need to train our minds. We need to gradually habituate them and train them over time in order to give rise to these kinds of attitudes. So people like you and I see our feelings of desire and our other mental afflictions grow stronger day by day. The problem is that we have not even been able to train our minds in the paths for people of lesser and medium scopes of practice. So we should recognize that we need to train our minds in those scopes, the lesser and medium scope, in order to be able to generate something like compassion. And so people who are intelligent and discriminating should stop giving any thought to practicing mistaken paths that any local shaman or follower of some deficient religion could master, like trying to get some sort of special powers of miraculous demonstration, or the ability to do sort of clairvoyance or something like that. Discriminating people should instead learn and contemplate and meditate upon the three collections of scripture, so the Vinaya, the Abhidharma, and the Sutras, which contain the three trainings, those being in ethics, meditative concentration, and wisdom. And these are contained, all of them, within the stages of the path to Buddhahood. So by training in this, or by studying this, we are able to train our minds properly in the essence of all of the Buddha's teachings as it's contained within the three baskets and these three higher trainings.
Oh yeah. Then it's a lam jirimba de la shuna. Ane sinedang. Ane kasore lamzo nasun. Kontu sheba nage ngaju chasam yada be tawada. Ane ngaji kebirimba la, dang kebirimba da sobirimba la sowaki menga tamje labrindi nala duyo inzam. Ane kasa ngaji rimba ni menje 추매치 니데 오베 라브르 냠선냐 발라 때네 오 데네 토마 아지 저바 찔랍다 데네 시나라 시라타 아니 데네 람투모마 주자네 아니 도지티 발 마슈티 가나 아니 람기비름 바다 조비름 발라 소바기 아니 추매니네 아니 산제주 코마토바기 레와야 아니 라브르 냠레 차발라 때네 온구레 아니 데네 차유
So if you start off on these steps or these stages to Buddhahood, then you will never err, and you will gradually gain the high meditative states called calm abiding, and the three principal paths, the three principal aspects of the path, and everything else on up to the two levels of the secret way, being the generation and the completion stage of the Vajrayana. So we have to begin, though, by first training our minds in these stages of the path, and then cultivating the kinds of realizations there, then getting to a special sort of mental quietude, this state of calm abiding, can join that with special insight, and then one is able to enter into the Vajrayana and engage in the path, the practices of the completion, or the generation and the completion stage. And this is the only hope we have of attaining Buddhahood. It rests then upon this very teaching. So this is the sort of way that we need to progress through these paths.
Oh yeah, that 가서 인지 전부다 맞게나 장주주 섬길라 탐 되게 탐매배 아니 전부 길에와 같이 소다 교치배 남양소련 발라 아니 장주 그 섬게 양주라 겨고 장주 그 섬길라 겨와라 오늘 인지 전부라 맞게 발라 장주 그 섬길라 겨와 매배 아니 인지 전부다 나라 겨겨고와 간제진이 대위로도 편조디 사변탄에 빼라 주자 유린서 롱제나라 멤버다고 대줘봐 대제다 그 통만이 이제 떼봐지 전에 반전 나와 잡을 수만 하신지 인제 침보대 아니 토다 파숨 산지 통다 파숨도 가야채와 토마 아니 사변나 빼충봐 와 산지 주 그만 토바라 자주 섬게고 자주 그 섬게바라 뒤응도 아니 이제 거와 아니 대의자와 인제 되 자주 그게 자와데 인제 나한테 저거와 인자 도리전주 가서 대의자와 인제 되 전에 송한 거래라 대의자 내가 인제 장점 부재체 다들 마찬에 인제 개발라야 아니 지금 마치도 아니 가서래 이제 명아도 오늘 다 돌아마 이래요 그러와 인자 전부 어느 도시 이제 전부 매년에 자주 좀 깨라 줄라 깨다 매배 이제 저와 같이 송 스타도 되는 마통데 이제 가서래 토다 파송도 같이 와 이제 토마 같이 와 이제 전부 다 줄라 저와 같이 버렸어요.
So, any hope we have of attaining Buddhahood then rests upon this very teaching, these stages of the path to enlightenment. And we must absolutely try to develop great compassion in our hearts. Because if we cannot develop this compassion, our Lama concluded, there is no way at all we can develop the sublime wish to achieve Buddhahood for the sake of every sentient beings. So if you want to engage in the trainings for the being of great capacity, one has to generate this attitude of bodhicitta, this wish to attain enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. And in order to generate that kind of attitude of bodhicitta, one needs to first develop compassion. As Chandrakirti has said in his entry to the middle way, at the beginning, I praise compassion. Compassion is like the seed. It is like the water that nurtures along the path, and it is like the great sort of ripening harvest of bodhisattvas. So at the beginning, he praises compassion as being important at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. It's important as like a seed that begins our practice of the great way, the Mahayana. And it's also important during that practice and at the end of that practice as well. And compassion is asserted to be the root of generating bodhicitta. So this attitude of compassion is something that we must make effort at generating, as it's indispensable to giving rise to bodhicitta, which is the only way that we can be practicing the Mahayana.
Oh yeah, 단이와 남소숨 그나나 샘게 샤바라 자주 그 샘샤바라 다스 사저 고만 하시니 안에 샘게 그 규제 안에 샘데 기비수 안에 샘데 기비체 제니다 사저 숨체 와다 담보되라 샘게 그 규제한테 너준대 남다 샘게기 샘바면나 라메 장주지 핀소주비 유르면조가 런데 남지 토마 장주 토마 런데 남지 장주 샘조 제세가라 다 코타다랑 와지병 해주 연아양 다대 저 가서래 삼바 자주 그 섬지 섬바지 마셔나 아니 다 라마 나는 뭐야다 봐서 산제주 고마토바 그 뒤를 민조회 장주지 핀소대 뒤를 민조회 다 런데 남지 아니 토마를 아니 예전 자주特别집에 나나 주발라 토마 아니 주고 자주 그 섬기를 깨가지고 그래 세라 런데 자주 섬 좋게 세다 드리는 말이야.
So then second is the wish for enlightenment. So here in the main outline of the text, it began with renunciation, and the second topic is bodhicitta. And so here, this is again divided into three sections. So the first is sort of why we need to develop this wish for enlightenment. The second is how to go about developing that wish, and then how to know when you have developed it. So here the root text reads, renunciation, though, can never bring the total bliss of matchless Buddhahood unless it's bound by the purest wish, and so the wise seek the high wish for enlightenment. So here, in order to be able to get to unsurpassed, complete, perfect enlightenment, one needs to have bodhicitta. Without that, even if you have a strong sense of renunciation, there's no way that you can achieve perfect, complete enlightenment. So if you want your virtuous activities to go towards that cause, to actually go towards the cause of bringing about perfect, complete enlightenment, you need to have in your mind has to be held by this altruistic aspiration for enlightenment in order to bring about that result.
Oh yeah, 这位电解是太单被我中个三把修差不也讲是夸太大了，俺那东华街上现在的夸了我几位，俺那我就修差不就原来样是，俺那我兄弟原来俺给我看起我特别举了着啊，是吧？特别举了着个人，这特别钱包个就没着吧。 特别举来，特别前面就是没着的，我就年上来要吧，是吧？我年上来要把人上，我得提醒我的是吧？特别前面就，但那参加完了，他妈làm做顺当是啊，提那呢，俺那强就什么结果我就过来是吧？làm做顺当，提那呢，俺那强就什么的结果过来是，强就什么的人不觉得，没那我是最初说七十米讲。 俺那头发起不差都没事，是吧？长久的什么的，原来我写说看没那样，俺那头发起不差都吹吧。俺那什么间他们就17股把他的18夸张，希望俺那夸是700年代了吧，18的。我什么间他就17股把他的了，作为长久的就是带年没做呗，是我写。 我写当就是70米元呢，头发起不差都没事吧？马上身边他们家40股把他大了作为，就带年没做呗，没做完也在也个拼做德云就是民主外噻的，全大的是送过的，拼做德云就是民主外噻，就是民主外，俺那他也让这全把当哦，也让这全把拿来呀。 俺那当年我说的到啊他把腿一给落的，我就个啥把睫毛嘛也不要花钱。 当年我说的到把有话来的，啥把钱就给谁买把衣裳，俺那三节个就没着吧，也让这些把那来。当年我说的到把是，人家设计日的不也讲，咱们厂家为钱就给谁买把两把的，是啊。
So here then, you may be able to gain some fierce feelings of renunciation. So by contemplating the defects of samsara and so forth, one may give rise to this strong attitude of renunciation as it's been described above. And any sort of virtues that you do under the influence of that attitude of renunciation, if they aren't held with bodhicitta, they can only go towards the result of an ordinary nirvana, it says here, towards one's own liberation alone. They can never serve to bring you to omniscient enlightenment, to the state of perfect, complete Buddhahood. And so we can see this from the fact that even practitioners of the lower paths, so these are usually referred to as hearers and solitary realizers, can possess true renunciation. These practitioners of lower paths have a sense of renunciation, and so held by that renunciation, renunciation, their virtues go towards the cause of bringing about their own enlightenment. But in order to get to perfect, complete Buddhahood, one needs to have this attitude of bodhicitta, of wishing to free other sentient beings from their sufferings. So for full enlightenment, then, a person needs to develop within his or her mind all three principal aspects of the path. And more specifically, he or she must have gained the second path, the wish to achieve enlightenment for every living being. So you may be able to get special types of clairvoyance or extrasensory powers or perform miracles, any sort of fantastic qualities. But unless you have this precious jewel in your heart, you will never enter that select group of people who practice the greater way. So without bodhicitta, then one can never enter into the path of the Mahayana. Without this highest wish, none of your qualities will ever bring you to total bliss. So as it says here in the verse, the total bliss of matchless Buddhahood, unless one has this attitude of bodhicitta, this altruistic aspiration to achieve enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings, none of one's virtues will go towards the cause of Buddhahood. So none of the sort of qualities that you develop or any of the paths that you develop, none of them will bring you to Buddhahood, the ability to free each and every living being from the troubles of cyclic life and from those of an escape from of a lower escape from cyclic life. So these practitioners of the lower kind of paths, hearers and solitary realizers, possess fine qualities like a huge mountain made of pure gold. They have generated renunciation, they have generated this wisdom realizing emptiness, and so they have these great qualities, but none of these qualities will bring them to Buddhahood because of the fact that they lack this wish to achieve enlightenment for the sake of every sentient being. So these lower practitioners may have pure renunciation and have the correct view of emptiness. They have cultivated wisdom realizing emptiness, but they won't ever go towards full enlightenment without generating this attitude of bodhicitta.
Oh yeah, that remember yin se. That chanju ji sem de yuan ani ju dang. Kun zhe le song ba da se ga na. Chanju sem ji ju na ge ji ge. Ko wi zhe le dan bi nyam da gong. 这些南极赛事国家的今天还没结为参加球入，现在送完那些这里进就干了。我长久个什么让就来结完那，俺那扩挖个嘞，这人那边伢们他扩完那边东亚送进伢们他把给，俺那看啥去那样是吧？这些能听着我的调来些比赛事球挖的，今天他那没人结挖个，俺那恰恰为那是球挖，他关键来送也都几百人是吧？ 恰恰于今天没结为恰恰就是说那些主要他没得结为恰恰于也是就话是我的安尼像就个什么就来结吧给年让这种你们把他这帮吧我太大讲安尼像就个是什么个都几日几过呢水军那把他安尼像就个什么是没搞我看起我他们这 안에 다 대략적으로 가라 가사티 겨와타나 차로라 생산직 집어 취재장 안에 들어와 집에 최수 들어와다 안에 산재주 고마토 바고 줄 들어와 산재주 줄 들어와 어 텐저와 돼야 안에 자사지 집어 들어와 아니 가서래 샘지 예비 가사대라 초지 산재 탐재지 안에 랑게 세단 들어와 공바 야
So, if you do gain this great wish, you become a person who truly deserves to have the entire world, with all its different kinds of beings, up to humans and gods, bow down at your feet, just as holy books like the Bodhisattva's Way of Life and Entry into the Middle Way and this heap of jewels describe it. So here, as it's described in the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, should bodhicitta come to birth in one who suffers languishes in the dungeons of samsara. In that instant, he is called a Buddha's heir, worshipful alike to gods and men. So by giving rise to this attitude of bodhicitta, one becomes worthy of worship by all beings. You find yourself in a different class of being. You then completely outshine listeners or hearers and solitary realizers, these practitioners of the lower path. By generating this attitude of bodhicitta, you become worthy of worship. You become one endowed with this kind of precious attitude. And so it continues saying that then every virtuous act you do, even down to throwing a scrap of food to a crow, becomes a practice of the greater way, of the Mahayana. It becomes a cause for your future Buddhahood. It becomes the way of life of a bodhisattva. So once you have generated this attitude of bodhicitta, every virtue that you do becomes a cause for Buddhahood. So it's imbued with this special sort of power.
아니 대화상의 출신 지신도 저우전에 사바 주와니 장주섬지 전신 다바야 저우지면 미세 파와 주로세네 저주스 말에 대화상의 현 안에 출신 그 도바 나지 랑아랑의 대화되게 남이지 저우테 아니 지산에 안에 대화되 사바 남이 저우 장주섬지 섬비 대화되라 안에 저우 치점제자 사바 매봐 그와상의 출신신도 저우전에 장주 섬지 전신 다바야 저우집에 안에 미세바 폐와를 주어서 많아지
So, and if you generate this kind of attitude of bodhicitta, then all of your virtuous activities, as I've said, are imbued with this special kind of power. Again, from the Bodhisattva's Way of Life by Shantideva, he says, all other virtues, like the plantain tree, produce their fruit, but then their force is spent. Alone, the marvelous tree of bodhicitta will bear its fruit and grow unceasingly. So when we do virtues without bodhicitta, they bear their fruit and then they're done, they're spent. They're not going to bring any more sort of good results from that. But on the contrast, those virtues that we do, imbued with this attitude of bodhicitta, held with this attitude, they continue to bear fruit. They continue to bring about good results beyond just that one time. So when we don't have bodhicitta, our virtues are relatively easily spent. They're quickly sort of gone. But when we have bodhicitta, all of our virtues continually bear fruit again and again.
안에 디바 좀 봐, 쳐봐라야. 안에 시부도 티도 또 쳐봐. 디바 또 이제 시도 미세봐. 대니 저왜 chan주 세면봐. 그냥 관계 수준이 뭐 주로 전에 소환하시 전에 안 디바 좀 봐라야. 안에 시도 또 쳐봐.
No. As well, bodhicitta is able to purify even very great negativities. So just as like the fires at the end of time, great negativities are utterly consumed by bodhicitta. So this attitude of bodhicitta also has an incredible power to purify or destroy the negativities that we have previously accumulated.
안에 디바치벨 티젠 남지 주고 인자 특바치베 남도 슈음 마슈장 안에 란주라 자주 섬게 맞게라 라려바다 안에 체지라 참 가서 체지라 참 미자양 참자 미자양 체지라 참자 미자양 안에 나그 냠내 또 첨보지 지가제 자주 그섬 제 마시나 체지라 참자 미야이 말에 체지라 참자 미자야 자주 그섬 예멜라 라레베 산제지 공만되나 아니 자주 그 셈라 알로 종거와 다 나와도 종고래
So we need to give rise to this attitude of bodhicitta. This attitude is what will allow us to gain great merit and purify great negativities. And even if we don't achieve Buddhahood in this life, we are only able to do that, to be able to achieve Buddhahood within one life with this attitude of bodhicitta. So it says the whole question of whether or not you've reached the greater way, so the sort of demarcation between being a practitioner of the Mahayana or not, is dependent upon whether whether we have bodhicitta. And then the whole question of whether you will be able to achieve Buddhahood in this one short life depend upon whether you have truly gained this wish. So if we don't have bodhicitta and do some sort of advanced Vajrayana practices that we think will allow us to be enlightened in one life, there's no chance that we can gain enlightenment in one life without this attitude. So one needs to have trained one's mind in bodhicitta in order to have any sort of hope of achieving Buddhahood, and especially for achieving Buddhahood within one short life.
Oh yeah, 다 장주지 심 집이 추대라 저 거와의 천산에 샘도 집이 추대라 아니 다 남자 자와라 슈라 추시 군지치세 슈차바 추시세라 다 추대라 오라 마정고 아래 유추치다 대위추시세를 가라 아니 대대위 추시 군지치와 제와 너가 내지 도바르까베 내지 아니 청와 담배 담바 너가 내지 청와 담배람 나도 좀봐 니지 자지 차외기 나서 아니 부스 쳐봐 최이 단체다 가사기 단체기 자지 차에 부스 쳐봐 말이 민박이 아니 봐 마치 그냥 쳐봐 타다 문매박이 아니 시바 코와라 제시 개와로 개네 아니 동아당 유동아 아니 차와도시 그동안 숨지 준제 매바라 나비 아니 내가 내다 주면 만남진 아주 쌈네 세거라 내가 인제지 깨니 인제 깨네 뒤제라 아니 동아지 나비 섬전 뒤탐제 아니 동아주단제 와라 자네 아니 타바 미네미냐데라 거바되바기 아니 체도 거비 체도 아니 라니라는 뭐야다 버저 산지 코만데고 더바제비 아니 셈리 제고가 인자 토만 인제 제주다 두심바레
So that concludes the section of the sort of reason why we need to give rise to bodhicitta. And then the second topic is how to actually go about developing this attitude of bodhicitta and the wish to attain enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. So this comes then in the 7th and 8th verses. So first it reads, they're swept along on 4 fierce river currents. So the explanation of this will come in the commentary, but there are 4 sort of causal rivers and 4 resultant ones. We'll get into that. And they're chained up tight in past deeds, hard to undo, stuffed into a steel cage of grasping at a self, and this is the 2 types of grasping at a self, both the self of persons and the self of phenomena, and smothered in the pitch black ignorance. This is the sort of state that our mother sentient beings are in. In a limitless round they're born, and in their births are tortured by 3 sufferings without a break. So they experience all of the sufferings, painful suffering, transformative suffering, pervasive suffering, all of these various types of suffering. And think how your mothers feel. Think of what's happening to them. Try to develop this highest wish. So the wish to achieve perfect, complete enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings, this wish is first developed by first generating compassion, recognizing the situation that they are in, and then wishing to attain that state of unsurpassed, perfect, complete enlightenment in order that you might be able to lead them there.
Oh yeah. 다 되라 가소래 내라 아니 인제 제고가 인장 아니 다 가소래 찬주 기심 뒤가나 이제 와다 대도 선도와 태양 진주래 섬전 남지 레네섬 사로냐도 삼잖아 편도 삼바야 단대바 뒤가나 찬주 기심이 파연이 송과래와 섬전 남지 레네섬 사로냐도 삼잖아 레바 고나위 아니 배 가소래 동화자면 살로냠도 사나 아니 편도 삼바 단대배 아니 섬전 삼바 티구나나데 섬전라 편도 보기 삼바단 대배 아니 소는 바도 매바다 대 사그레스 댄주그레스 섬전 찍으려네 아데 가소래 아니 가서 봐도 뭐 대주나 sem제를 믿어 봐 봐도 봐 sem제를 다 많이 봐 sem제 봐도 봐 아니 봐도 매 동화 싸와 최신 레랑 대화 빠매라 그봐 대발라 아니 소나 봐도 봐 싸와지 다 여봐지 매시고세
So then here, in order to develop bodhicitta, this highest wish, one needs to first develop compassion, an attitude of compassion towards beings. Now here, turning to the benefits of bodhicitta, this attitude of bodhicitta, it says then, even just wishing you could stop the headache of someone else can bring you merit without measure because of the helpful intent you feel. What need then to mention the wish that you could stop the immeasurable pain of every being and put everyone in a state of measureless happiness. So here, this is coming from the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, discussing the benefits of bodhicitta. And if one has a thought to get rid of even just like the headache of another being, having this attitude of wanting to benefit them, you're motivated by a desire to benefit that other being, if even that brings you merit without measure because one has that kind of attitude of wishing to help, wishing to be of benefit, then what need is there to mention this wish of bodhicitta, which is wanting to stop all of the pain of all sentient beings without exception?
뭐야? 아니 가서 조위치다 좀 접이 뒤지쳐자 뒤에노 실험 참신 두바이 조윙 아신치 시바 코벨람도 투신 아니 대당 아서비 아니 제신야 자주 섬지 있어 실험 참신 두바이 조윙 아신 제신 로와 탐장 안로라 로와 셰비 지대 있잖아 다 단지 순지 봐야 바도 매버지 가서 지유가를 송만 하시잖아요 대당 아니 대빠지고 시위도에 가서 상주 섬지 쏘나무가 대라 가대 소제나 남게 감네 군가데 대날 대외 라바 주르세다 상주 섬지 쏘남 대라 가대 소지 유에나 아니 남게 군데 군가데 대래장 안에 라바 주르 시송바게 상주 섬지 파연 타야바 송바나 체
So these verses are having us recall the benefits, the countless benefits of bodhicitta. There are other verses also from the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, saying that it is the sovereign remedy that perfectly allays all maladies. It is the wishing tree bestowing rest on those who wander wearily the pathways of existence. It is the universal vehicle that saves all wandering beings from the states of loss. The rising moon of the enlightened mind that soothes the sorrows born of the afflictions, and so forth. All of these verses are expounding upon the qualities, the benefits of bodhicitta, the sort of countless benefits that come from them. And in addition, here in the text, it quotes from the sutra that Viradatta requested, where it says that were the merit of the wish for enlightenment to take on some kind of physical form, it would fill the reaches of space itself and then spill over farther still. So we should, as we are going through this, recall, think about, and remember the benefits, the countless benefits of bodhicitta and this attitude of enlightenment.
오야 다 대대로 chanchu kisam jeba jebala 다 공도 시와 나신 전에 아니 这玩意就全部拿去交过，这玩意就全部交完了。俺那东华身边东华就拿完了，没事吧？俺那他没事吧？个人家交过完人家，俺那身边东华就拿出写过人吧的。那身边东华就拿出写完了，俺那等到的，我就在休息，军纪7日谁干了？俺那马身边他们家东华修茶吧的，俺那开着来在那看修茶吧。 네, 루카르라 되는 중앙에 세네 초시스. 대배 초스. 대배 시부 초세와네 아니 대박이 되자. 대비 세바. 대배 세듯이 세바. 안다위 초세와네 아니 따와 알아서와. 지도라 따와 타집에 따와 로바 따와라서와. 아니 어때지? 따와 대다. 아니 세비 초세와네 아니 감고마이와 편지기 아니 세바 되자. 감숨도 제와 lenje que sepa teran debi medan lar jewa jen penje ge ane sebate dejade sebatela one kasore debi chu seche ane da 강 고만 라지와 렌지 잠바 대사 칸들 그래서 시비초 시비초 세대체 리비초 시비초 어 대단하 안에 토만 직다기 샤완도 추니 단지 말을 받고 나라데 직다기 왕을 따와기 왕을 랭고와 이자 따위초 지체 안에 대단 순방 잡아 말을 봐 말을 비추 그 단지 말을 봐 말을 봐대 규디지 초 시체 규디지 초 시가 때는 말을 듣고 나라데 레사 레디 바자 아니 가서래 실행기 실행 바자 샤데 남시 딘도 샤바데 아니 실행기 세다데 실행기 세다발라 때네 아니 데비 추 겨와당 가와당 나와다 치와당 라서와게 아니 가서래 제가 나지 춤니 주시도 전에 아니 동화숨지 진짜면 받에 나와지 온 거와 인상 다른 대송도 말이 비추어 주디지 추어 시당 겨와당 가와당 나와다 치와데 저디지 추어시 균지 추어서 체싱에서 다른 마신도요 균지 추어시 체싱에서 추어디 균지 나도 체양세 네 강라남 타배 담바다 아니 추어대달라 도가와是吧 그 저간에 지금 동화대달라 도바가와 레지 샤바양 칭화 담비 담바 세 레지 샤베 레니지 왕게 칭화 징바 야
So, in order to generate this attitude of bodhicitta, one first, again, the benefits are sort of limitless, and one should recall those benefits. Now, in order to generate bodhicitta, we need to have a kind of loving compassion for sentient beings, for all sentient beings, that's automatic, where we see them all as being pleasant, and we have a kind of compassion, wishing to free them from their sufferings. And in order to generate that kind of compassion, again, we have to think about the ways in which they're suffering, understand the suffering situation of sentient beings. So as it says in this verse then, they're swept along on 4 fierce river currents. And here, these can be divided or sort of understood as 4 rivers or river currents that act as causes, and those that are sort of the ripening of that, the result of those. So here, the mass of living beings, all of them are mothers, are swept along the flow of 4 river currents, which are all fierce suffering. From one viewpoint, while these are acting as causes, these 4 are the torrent of desire. So the torrent or the current of desire, of wanting, sort of clinging to things, grasping after our attachments and so forth. These are one of the 4 sort of torrents that are carrying our mother sentient beings along. And then there is the torrent of views. Here, this includes things like the view of the perishable collection, those views, the 5 sort of wrong views that we can have. And all of these are subsumed within this category of views or wrong views. And then there is the torrent of the ripe force of deeds. So here, the force of our deeds ripening into particular situations is another torrent in which our mother sentient beings are swept along. And then there is the torrent of ignorance, referring to this ignorance grasping at a self, misapprehending a self. And so these 4 are the sort of causal river currents or torrents that are carrying along mother sentient beings in this situation of suffering. And then later, when they serve as results, they are the 4 torrents of birth, aging, sickness, and death. So due to the force of ignorance, this ignorance grasping at a self, sentient beings create karmas, and those karma or action put down an imprint, a potency on their mental mental continuum, which then ripen into all of the sort of suffering experiences that they have. So this is the kind of situation that they are in, wherein due to this force of ignorance and their wrong views and desires and so forth, they are putting down karmic effects, and then when those ripen into various results, these beings experience the sufferings of birth, aging, sickness, and death, and all of the other types of suffering due to that situation they're in.
오야 단들이 내지 샤바람 청와 담배 담바스 대장 미세바 dom지기 내지 샤바 태양 아니 배 가소래 다 빼라 제가나 자지참 배 정바다 천다도 많이 봐 손도도 저가와 다 가자 저가에 자지 자다게 담바 나신 샤바티다 담보 제가와 배인바리 정바다 천다 많이 봐 저가와 탈가와 자다게 내지 샤바 담바 답이 아니다 당진지 자지 자위 어느 부수 취대 출발해 다양 대라 니모저지이나 아니 샹라 벨라 시간에 샹라로 로드와 다 친제지 레와 체주지 연나양 대달 멤버 아니 말이 뭐지 군에 특別 대달 멤버 참모 난군답이 민비 마름단자비 치위신도 쳐왔답이 말이 멤버 막전지 군에 특징 아니 무단 탐매바게 무단 탐매바게 아니 스바 자소를 제시했다 코비 자소를 제심 제와나 아니 다 권도 샤바게 동아지 규 아니 차와도 저거 동아 속에 아니 규제 매바 뒤 따도 내외 다 된다 아니 관인지 매바 가서 동아지 내외 섬전태다 동아긴 다 규 추고 시왕기 아니 제위 추고 시우디 추디 아니 제가 나시 그 바가 가와다 나와라 소와기 다 나주도 마스tam데 갈라다 로자도 심바레
So these mother beings are not just hurtling along in these four great rivers. It's just as if their hands and feet too were bound fast, that they were chained up tight and snared in their own past deeds, hard to undo. So it's as though they're being carried along on these four river currents, and they're also sort of tied, bound up by the past deeds that they have done. But that isn't all. The bonds which hold them tight are no regular ties like twined ropes of yak skin or hair. It's more like our mothers are clasped in fetters of iron, ever so hard to sever, ever so hard to unshackle. While they are swept along, they are stuffed into a steel cage of grasping to some non-existent self. So while they're in this situation of being carried along by all of these river currents of the four causal ones of desire and views and ignorance and their ripening deeds, and they are also sort of chained up by the past actions that they have done. And then they are bound by this ignorance, like stuffed into a steel cage of grasping at some non-existent self. So this is something that is difficult to get out of, that one can't like sever or cut oneself out of. And then there's more to this situation. If there were some daylight, these mother beings might have some glimmer of hope. They could at least cry out or try to get some help. But it is night. It is the darkest hour of the night, and in pitch black dark, they are swept downstream in the mighty river. They are smothered completely in pitch black ignorance. So they are like as if they were in this cloud or darkness of ignorance, and so when they don't know how to even cry out for help. And in this limitless round, this endless round, they are born into the ocean of life, and in these births they are tortured by the three different kinds of suffering: the suffering of suffering, the suffering of change, and the all-pervasive suffering. And their torture comes to them without a break. It is always there. So they're swept along in these four currents, the four sort of causal currents, the four resultant currents. They're bound up by their own past deeds, as well as being like shackled in a steel cage, which is akin to our ignorance grasping at a self. And then they're in this sort of darkness of ignorance. So contemplating like this, we train our minds, we habituate ourselves to seeing the kind of suffering situation that sentient beings are in, such that we're then able to give rise to compassion and eventually bodhicitta.
Oh yeah. 가서래 내가 딘다 주에 만남진 안주 삼네 세가나 되다 가서래 동아지 나서 삼네 와 팀내서 탐의 문맥이 세배 자소 제신 깨와라 동아지 동아다 교회 동아 차와도지 동아 속지 균잼매봐 뒤따도 나네 아니 동아 서가봐 서버가위 아니 내가 딘다와라 교장 아니 삼장 코란지 원에 차다 가야 매봐 말한 거는 차다 가야 매라서 다 될라 덤비 뉴바데 레부 쿠데스라 파 냐면나 아니 라라 파다 라라 파 쿠라라 파바데 파바데 셴네 아니 덤비 탑 다다 라라 아니 줍도 예배나 아니 만한 동아지나 영 아주 쌈네 텔라 저거 쿠제 당연하다 또 담보 동아다 자듯이 삼바제 아니 동아단 잡아대 쿠데 아니 가서 라라 파와제 셈네 만은 동아지나 영 아주 쌈네 텔라 저거 쿠르제베 하삼라서와 림지 로장데 아니 자주지 셈데 자주지 셈을 뭐지 왜 탈라 받고 그래
So this is what's happening to them, our mother sentient beings. This is their situation, unbearable pain, and there's nothing that they can do like this to help themselves. The son, though, has a chance at hand to pull his mother free. He must find a way, and find it now, to grasp her hand and draw her out. So there's no sort of way for sentient beings to get out of this situation by themselves. One then contemplates in this way, thinking that, and the way he must try is to develop this dual wish for enlightenment. He must do so first by thinking of how his mothers feel, tortured by pain, and then deciding to take personal responsibility, the duty of freeing them upon himself, and so on in all the proper stages. So one comes to recognize that sentient beings are in this situation where they are unable to extricate themselves from samsara, and thinking about the pain and suffering that they feel, the way that they are tortured, one wishes to be able to pull them out of that situation, get them out, and decides to take responsibility oneself, to take on the burden of freeing them, and in this way trains one's mind sequentially in the various stages to the point where one gives rise to bodhicitta.
Oh yeah. 다 되네 대순도 가서 로장데 창주 섬을 뭐지 집에 타라 배고 대개와라 아니 가서래 창주지 섬을 뭐지 깨와기 아니 가서래 탑대다란 게 삼고 와래 삼발라 답이 마신도 로장고다 다 오라마 동거와 창주 섬 깨와그 아니 제주 중아망아마 온도 손데 아니 마 아망아마 온도 손데 아니 치마치마 쪼고 여자야 아니 아망아마 삼 중아마든 돌아 삼 기주대자 아니랑 그 삼고 삼발라 아니 가서 로장주데 마 아니 태우고 태우고와 인세요 근데 신에 아니 다 마신도 로장네 아니 섬전 탐제 대화다 된도기 落汤浪就要把这强把人送走，是吧？东华党长对起落汤浪要把这人接，但这咱们也让他也巧个的，是吧？
So one needs to make effort then at the ways of giving rise to this mind of bodhicitta. So in order to sequentially train one's mind to actually be able to give rise to a mind of bodhicitta, one needs to first have trained in the sort of beginning stages, and the latter stages of development depend upon having given rise to those earlier sorts of states of mind. So in order to be able to generate these kinds of attitudes towards sentient beings, you have to move in a sort of sequence, in stages, such that it makes kind of logical sense, and then one is eventually able to generate full-blown bodhicitta. But these latter stages will only come if one has first trained in the earlier ones. So to contemplate it, he must first learn about it from another. So we first have to learn about this method. We have to hear about it from someone else and then contemplate it and integrate it into our mind through meditation. And the stages for being able to generate bodhicitta begin with things like loving kindness, of having an almost obsessive desire that each and every living being have happiness. So loving kindness is this attitude that wishes happiness for other beings. And compassion is this almost obsessive desire that they be free of any pain. So compassion is an attitude wishing to free sentient beings from their suffering. And these are parts of the stages that one goes through in order to generate bodhicitta.
나의 다운 대사죠.
So we'll stop there for now.
예배제 조제메노다 리라네 제닌데 제마데 산제신도 메데보아 로게 남다 진나 제와 조예 당구르라나 메라라 담니야다야.
Hi, everyone. Please listen up. I have a little list. That means it's going to be a little longer, so sorry.